Some people think that getting older means you become weak, invisible, forgotten. They think gray hair means you've lost your fire, that wrinkles mean you've lost your fight. Let me tell you something about assumptions. They can be the most dangerous thing you ever make about someone, especially when that someone is a 73-year-old woman who spent decades learning that respect isn't given, it's demanded. And sometimes, when words fail, you have to get creative with your lessons. My name is Joyce Hamilton, and this is the story of how one cold Thanksgiving night changed everything. It's about betrayal, dignity, and the kind of justice that only comes when you've lived long enough to know that sometimes the best revenge is simply showing someone exactly who they really are. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 73 years on this earth, and I thought I'd seen every kind of cruelty that humans could inflict on each other. I was wrong. The worst cruelty, I discovered, comes wrapped in the familiar faces of family, delivered with a smile that doesn't reach the eyes, and justified with excuses that sound reasonable until you really listen to what's being said. I had raised 3 children as a single mother after my husband passed when I was 45. Michael was my youngest, my baby, the one who used to crawl into my lap when thunderstorms scared him, the one who promised he'd always take care of his mama when he grew up. Life has a way of taking those sweet promises and twisting them into something unrecognizable. The invitation came in October, just as the leaves were starting to turn in my little town of Millbrook. Michael called me, his voice carrying that slightly forced cheerfulness that I'd begun to recognize over the past 3 years since he'd married Rebecca. "Mom, Becca and I were talking, and we really want you to come spend Thanksgiving with us this year," he said, and I could hear her voice in the background, though I couldn't make out the words. "We've got the new house all set up, and we thought it would be nice to have family around." I had been to their house exactly twice since they'd moved to Riverside, about an hour's drive from my apartment. Both times, I'd felt like an intruder in my own son's life. Rebecca had a way of making polite conversation that felt like she was checking items off a list, and Michael seemed to fade into the background whenever she was around, like he was, afraid of saying something that might upset the delicate balance of their household. But this was my son, my baby, asking me to share Thanksgiving with them. Despite everything, despite the way Rebecca looked at me like I was something she'd stepped in, despite the way Michael seemed to have forgotten how to laugh the way he used to, I said yes. "That sounds wonderful, sweetheart," I told him, and I meant it. Family is family, after all, and I'd raised that boy to be better than the distance that had grown between us. Maybe this would be the chance to bridge that gap. I spent the week before Thanksgiving preparing. I made my famous sweet potato casserole, the one that had been requested at every family gathering for 20 years. I picked out a nice outfit, something that would show Rebecca I could still clean up well, even if I was just a retired school teacher living on a pension. I even bought a bottle of wine, something nicer than I usually splurged on, because I wanted to contribute to their dinner. The drive to Riverside on Thanksgiving morning was beautiful. The autumn sun was shining through the bare branches, and I found myself humming old songs that Michael used to love when he was little. I was genuinely excited, perhaps more than I'd been for any holiday in years. The loneliness that had settled into my bones since retiring had been particularly heavy lately, and the prospect of spending time with family felt like a balm to my soul. Their house was impressive, I had to admit. A large colonial with a perfect lawn and carefully maintained landscaping. Rebecca's Mercedes was in the driveway next to Michael's truck, and I could see warm light glowing from the windows. It looked like a magazine photograph of what a family home should be. Michael answered the door, and for a moment, I saw my little boy again in his smile. He hugged me tight, and I could smell the cologne I'd given him for his birthday. "Mom, you made it. Come in, it's freezing out there." The house was immaculate, decorated with autumn themes that looked like they'd been professionally arranged. Everything was in its place, from the throw pillows on the cream-colored sofa to the artificial fall leaves arranged just so on the mantelpiece. It was beautiful, but it felt cold somehow, like a showroom rather than a home. Rebecca emerged from the kitchen wearing a stunning burgundy dress that probably cost more than I spent on clothes in 6 months. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. "Joyce," she said, air-kissing my cheek without actually making contact. "So wonderful to see you again. You look, well?" The pause before "well" was carefully calculated, just long enough to make me aware that she was being charitable with the compliment. I chose to ignore it, focusing instead on the delicious smells coming from the kitchen. "Something smells absolutely divine," I said, handing her the wine. "Thank you so much for having me. I brought my sweet potato casserole." She took the wine without looking at the label and glanced at my covered dish with what I could only describe as polite disdain. "Oh, how thoughtful. I'm afraid we already have our menu planned, but I'm sure we can find somewhere to put it." The dismissal was subtle, but unmistakable. This was her kitchen, her dinner, her show. I was just a guest who'd brought something that didn't fit into her carefully orchestrated event. Michael seemed oblivious to the undercurrent of tension, chattering away about his job at the marketing firm, about the neighbors they'd met, about the golf course nearby where he'd started playing on weekends. I listened and nodded, but I was watching Rebecca, noticing how she checked her phone, how she glanced at her watch, how she seemed to be enduring rather than enjoying the conversation. Dinner was exquisite. I had to give her that. The table was set with china that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and every dish was perfectly prepared and beautifully presented. The turkey was moist, the stuffing was flavorful, and the wine paired perfectly with the meal. Rebecca had clearly worked hard to create a memorable dinner. But something was missing. There was no warmth, no laughter, no stories shared over the meal. Michael made attempts at conversation, asking about my health, my neighbors, my garden. But Rebecca's responses to my answers were minimal, and the silences stretched longer and longer. I tried to fill the gaps, sharing stories about Michael's childhood, about the Thanksgivings we'd had when he was growing up, about the traditions we'd created together. But I could see Rebecca's eyes glazing over, and even Michael seemed uncomfortable, like he was embarrassed by the memories of a simpler time. After dinner, as we sat in the living room, I made the mistake of asking about their guest room. "I hope it won't be too much trouble having me stay overnight," I said to Rebecca. "Michael mentioned that you have a lovely guest room upstairs." The silence that followed was deafening. Rebecca and Michael exchanged a look that I couldn't interpret, and then Rebecca smiled that perfectly practiced smile that never reached her eyes. "Oh, Joyce, I'm so sorry. I thought Michael had mentioned it to you. We're actually having the guest room redone right now. The contractors left quite a mess, and it's just not habitable at the moment." I looked at Michael, confused. He hadn't mentioned anything about construction when he'd invited me to stay the night. "I could take the couch," I offered, feeling foolish for not having asked about the arrangements earlier. "The thing is," Rebecca continued, her voice taking on a tone that suggested she was being infinitely patient with a difficult situation, "we're expecting Michael's college roommate and his wife to stop by later tonight. They're driving through on their way to her parents' house, and we promised them they could crash here for a few hours. The living room is really the only space we have available." I felt a cold knot forming in my stomach, but I pressed on. "Well, surely there's somewhere I could sleep. I don't take up much room." Rebecca sighed, as if I was being deliberately obtuse. "The master bedroom is ours, obviously. The guest room is uninhabitable. The living room is promised to the Johnsons. There's really nowhere else. What about the den?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I asked, grasping at straws. Or even just a sleeping bag somewhere? Another exchange of looks between my son and his wife. This time, Michael cleared his throat uncomfortably. Mom, the thing is, Becca has everything arranged for the Johnsons. They're important business contacts, and she's put a lot of effort into making sure they're comfortable. The implication was clear. I was less important than business contacts. I was the inconvenience that hadn't been properly planned for. I suppose I could drive home tonight, I said quietly, though the thought of making that hour-long drive in the dark after the wine I'd had with dinner was not appealing. Oh, but you shouldn't drive, Rebecca said quickly. You've been drinking, and it's dangerous for someone your age to be on the road at night. Someone my age. As if I was ancient and feeble instead of a woman who had been driving for over 50 years without incident. Well then, what do you suggest? I asked, and I heard the edge creeping into my voice despite my efforts to remain calm. Rebecca's smile became even more artificial. Actually, we do have a solution. The garage is heated, and we have that old daybed out there from when Michael was in college. It's not ideal, but it's warm and dry, and it's just for one night. The garage. She was suggesting that I sleep in the garage like some kind of vagrant. I looked at Michael, waiting for him to protest, to offer his own bed, to tell his wife that his mother was not sleeping in the garage. But he was staring at his hands, his face flushed with embarrassment, saying nothing. The garage, I repeated, just to make sure I had heard correctly. It's really quite comfortable, Rebecca assured me, as if she was offering me a luxury suite. We've got it set up with some nice blankets, and there's even a space heater if you get cold. It's like camping, but warmer. Camping. She was comparing making me sleep in their garage to camping. The worst part wasn't the insult itself. The worst part was watching my son, my baby, the child I had sacrificed everything for, sit there and allow his wife to treat his mother like she was less than human. The worst part was realizing that this hadn't been a miscommunication or a misunderstanding. This had been planned. I sat there for a long moment, feeling the weight of 73 years settling on my shoulders. I thought about all the times I had gone without so that Michael could have what he needed. I thought about the jobs I'd worked, the sacrifices I'd made, the nights I'd stayed up with him when he was sick, the way I'd cheered at every little league game and school play and graduation ceremony. And now I was being offered a bed in the garage. Well, I said finally, standing up with as much dignity as I could muster, I suppose that will have to do. Rebecca's relief was palpable. Oh, wonderful. You're being so understanding about this. I'll help you get settled. The garage was clean, I had to give her that. The daybed was actually comfortable, and there were several blankets folded neatly at the foot of the bed, but it was still a garage. It still smelled of motor oil and lawnmower gas. It was still the place where they kept their cars and their tools and their garbage cans, and it was where Becca Hamilton thought Joyce Hamilton belonged. There's a bathroom in the basement that you can access through that door, Rebecca said, pointing to a door I hadn't noticed. And if you need anything, just knock on the door to the house. We'll hear you. She said it like she was doing me a favor, like I should be grateful for access to a bathroom. After she left, I sat on the edge of that daybed and stared at the concrete floor. The space heater hummed in the corner, fighting against the November cold that seeped through the garage door. I could hear voices and laughter from inside the house, the sounds of my son and his wife entertaining their important business contacts while his mother tried to fall asleep next to their garbage cans. I had never felt so small, so disposable, so utterly without worth. But as I lay there in the dark, listening to the sounds of the house settling around me, something began to shift inside my chest. The hurt was still there, sharp and immediate. But underneath it, something else was growing, something that had been dormant for too long. I reached for my phone and made a call. It was late, but I knew she'd still be awake. "Margaret, it's Joyce. I know it's Thanksgiving night, but I need a favor, a big one." Margaret Chen had been my best friend for over 20 years. We'd taught at the same school, raised our children, in the same neighborhood, and weathered more storms together than I could count. She was also one of the smartest people I knew, with connections that stretched far beyond our little town of Millbrook. "Joyce, honey, what's wrong? You sound upset." I told her everything, the whole humiliating story, from the moment I'd walked into their perfect house to the moment I'd been relegated to sleeping in their garage. Margaret listened without interrupting, but I could hear her breathing getting shorter and shorter as I talked. "That little witch," she said finally, and I had to smile despite everything. Margaret never cursed, so witch was about as strong as her language got. "And Michael just sat there and let it happen?" "He didn't say a word." "I'm coming to get you right now." "No," I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. "I'm going to stay the night. But Margaret, I need you to make some calls for me. I need some information, and I need it fast." "What kind of information?" I told her what I was thinking, the plan that was forming in my mind as I spoke. Margaret was quiet for a long moment after I finished. "Joyce, are you sure about this? It's going to be expensive, and it's going to be complicated, and there's no guarantee it will work the way you want it to." "I'm sure," I said. And I was. For the first time in years, I was absolutely certain about something. I've got some savings, and I've got time. What I don't have is my dignity, and I'm going to get it back. "All right then," Margaret said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "Let's give them a Thanksgiving they'll never forget." I hung up the phone and pulled the blankets up to my chin. The garage was cold, and the daybed was lumpy, and I could smell the exhaust from their cars every time I took a deep breath. But for the first time since I'd walked into their house that morning, I felt something other than hurt and humiliation. I felt anticipation. Becca Hamilton had made a mistake when she decided to treat Joyce Hamilton like garbage. She'd forgotten that teachers are, by nature, educators, and some lessons, the most important ones, can't be taught with words. Some lessons require a much more hands-on approach. As I drifted off to sleep in that cold garage, I was already planning the education that Becca Hamilton was going to receive. It was going to be comprehensive. It was going to be unforgettable. And it was going to teach her something that her privileged life had apparently never bothered to show her. Every person deserves respect, regardless of their age, their income, or their place in your perfectly ordered world. And when you forget that lesson, life has a way of reminding you in the most unexpected ways. The space heater clicked off sometime during the night, and I woke up shivering. Through the small window in the garage door, I could see the first hints of dawn breaking over the horizon. Inside the house, everything was quiet. The important business contacts had presumably come and gone, entertained in the living room that was too precious for Michael's mother to sleep in. I got up and folded the blankets neatly, making the daybed as tidy as I'd found it. I used the basement bathroom to freshen up as best I could, and then I walked through the quiet house to the kitchen, where I found Michael sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, still in his pajamas. He looked up when I entered, and I saw guilt written across his face in letters so large they might as well have been painted there. "Mom," he said quietly, "how did you sleep?" "About as well as you'd expect," I replied, pouring myself a cup of coffee from the pot he'd made. "In a garage." He winced. "Look, I'm sorry about that. Becca had everything planned out, and when the Johnsons called to say they were coming through—" "The Johnsons," I repeated. "Your important business contacts." "Yeah, they're potential clients, and Becca thought it was important to make a good impression." I sat down across from him and studied his face. This was my son, the child I'd raised, and yet he felt like a stranger. When had he become someone who thought business contacts were more important than his own mother? When had he become someone who would let his wife treat his family like inconveniences to be managed? "Michael," I said carefully, "do you remember when you were 8 years old and you came home from school crying because Tommy Peterson had called you names?" He nodded, looking confused about where I was going with this. "Do you remember what I told you?" "You said that how people treat others says more about them than it does about the people they're treating." "That's right. And what else did I tell you?" He was quiet for a moment, thinking. "You said that if I ever saw someone being treated badly, it was my job to speak up, even if it was hard, even if it was scary." "Especially if it was scary," I corrected, "because that's when speaking up matters most." The kitchen was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of Rebecca's hairdryer from upstairs. "Mom, It's all right, sweetheart," I said, reaching across the table to pat his hand. "I understand. Marriage is complicated, and you have to pick your battles." Relief flooded his face, and that made my heart ache even more. He thought I was letting him off the hook, forgiving him for his cowardice. And I was, in a way. But forgiveness and consequences are two different things, and Michael was about to learn that lesson too. Rebecca came downstairs a few minutes later, perfectly put together despite the early hour. She was dressed in yoga pants and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month, and her hair and makeup were flawless. "Joyce, you're up early. I hope you were comfortable last night." The way she said it with that bright artificial cheerfulness made it clear that she knew exactly how uncomfortable I'd been and didn't care at all. "It was quite an experience," I said evenly. "Thank you for your hospitality." "Of course. I'm just sorry we couldn't accommodate you better. The house really is full to capacity right now." Full to capacity. As if I took up more space than I actually did, as if my presence was a burden too great for their large house to bear. "I should probably head home soon," I said, standing up and rinsing my coffee cup in the sink. "I don't want to overstay my welcome." "Oh, you're not overstaying," Rebecca said quickly, though her tone suggested the opposite. "But I'm sure you have things to do at home." Michael walked me to my car, carrying my overnight bag and the untouched sweet potato casserole that hadn't been worthy of their perfect Thanksgiving table. He hugged me goodbye, and I could feel his guilt in the tightness of his embrace. "I love you, Mom," he said quietly. "I love you too, baby," I replied. And I meant it. I would always love him, even when he disappointed me, even when he hurt me. That's what mothers do. But love doesn't mean accepting unacceptable behavior. Love sometimes means teaching difficult lessons, even when those lessons are painful for everyone involved. The drive home was quiet, my mind already working through the details of what I needed to do. Margaret would have made her calls by now, and I had some calls of my own to make. There were arrangements to be made, plans to be put into motion, and a lesson to be prepared. Becca Hamilton thought she knew everything about class, about sophistication, about what mattered in life. She was about to discover that there's a difference between having money and having class, between being sophisticated and being wise, between knowing what things cost and understanding what things are worth. And she was going to learn that lesson from a 73-year-old retired schoolteacher who had just spent the night in a garage, being treated like something her son's wife had scraped off her shoe. The student was about to become the teacher, and class was about to begin. Monday morning after Thanksgiving arrived gray and bitter, matching my mood perfectly. I sat in my small kitchen, nursing my second cup of coffee and staring out at the bare branches of the oak tree in my backyard. The tree had been there when I'd bought this little house 30 years ago, and I'd watched it grow from a sapling into something strong and enduring. Right now, it looked as stripped and vulnerable as I felt. My phone had been ringing all morning. Margaret, checking in to see how I was doing and to report on the calls she'd made over the weekend. My daughter, Sarah, calling from Portland to see how Thanksgiving had gone. My sister Ruth, wanting to hear about Michael's new house. Each conversation required me to decide how much truth to tell, how much of my humiliation to share, how much of my pain to reveal. With Margaret, I was completely honest. She'd known me too long and too well for me to pretend that everything was fine. With Sarah and Ruth, I found myself editing, softening the edges of what had happened, making excuses for Rebecca and Michael that I didn't really believe, but that seemed necessary to preserve some semblance of family harmony. She was just overwhelmed with hosting, I heard myself telling Sarah. You know how stressful holidays can be when you're trying to make everything perfect. But Mom, she made you sleep in the garage, Sarah said, her voice tight with anger. That's not about being overwhelmed. That's about being cruel. Sarah had never liked Rebecca, not from the moment Michael had brought her home 3 years ago. She'd seen through the polished exterior to something harder underneath, something calculating and cold. At the time, I'd thought Sarah was being unfair, judging Rebecca too harshly because she was different from the kind of woman we'd expected Michael to choose. Now I wondered if Sarah had simply seen what I'd been too hopeful to recognize. It was just one night, I said, though the words tasted bitter in my mouth. I survived worse things. That's not the point, Mom. The point is that you shouldn't have had to survive it at all. You're his mother, for God's sake. After I hung up with Sarah, I sat in the silence of my house and let myself really feel the weight of what had happened. The embarrassment was still there, sharp and immediate every time I thought about lying on that daybed in their garage, listening to their laughter through the walls. But underneath the embarrassment was something deeper and more painful. The recognition that my relationship with my youngest son had fundamentally changed. Michael had chosen his wife over his mother. When it came down to making a choice between Rebecca's comfort and my dignity, he'd chosen Rebecca. And while I understood that marriage required loyalty, I also understood that there were lines that shouldn't be crossed, boundaries that shouldn't be breached, basic human decencies that shouldn't be negotiable. Making your mother sleep in the garage was one of those non-negotiables. The phone rang again around noon, and this time it was Margaret with news. I've made the calls, she said without preamble. My cousin Danny in real estate, he knows the Riverside area like the back of his hand. He's got some ideas about properties. That might work for what you're planning. And my friend Patricia, the one who works for that event planning company, she's intrigued by your idea. Says it's ambitious but doable if you're serious about the investment. I'm serious, I said, and I meant it. I'd spent the weekend thinking about nothing else, turning the plan over in my mind from every angle, considering the risks and the potential rewards. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that this was the right approach. It's going to cost you, Joyce. Even doing it the way we discussed, you're looking at a significant chunk of your savings. I had been careful with money my entire adult life. After my husband died, I'd had to be. Teaching didn't pay much, and raising 3 children on a single income had required careful planning and constant sacrifice. But I'd managed to save, putting away what I could whenever I could, investing conservatively, living modestly. The nest egg I'd accumulated wasn't enormous, but it was substantial enough to give me options. How much are we talking about? I asked. Margaret gave me the figures her contacts had estimated, and I felt my breath catch. It was more than I'd expected, though not more than I could manage if I was careful about it. That includes everything? I asked. The rental, the setup, the whole production? Everything we discussed. Danny thinks he can find you exactly what you're looking for, and Patricia says her company can handle all the logistics. The question is whether you're really ready to spend that kind of money on what amounts to a very expensive lesson. I thought about the lesson Rebecca had taught me on Thanksgiving night, about the value she'd placed on my comfort and dignity. I thought about the lesson Michael had learned about loyalty and courage, or rather, the lesson he'd failed to learn. Some lessons are worth whatever they cost, I said finally. Set up the meetings. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity that I hadn't experienced since I'd retired from teaching. I met with Danny Chen, Margaret's cousin, who turned out to be a sharp-eyed man in his 50s with an encyclopedic knowledge of the Riverside real estate market. He showed me photographs of properties, discussed neighborhoods and accessibility, talked about the kind of impression different locations would make. "You want something that screams money," he said during our second meeting, spread photographs across my kitchen table like he was dealing cards. "Something that makes people stop and stare, something that makes them immediately start calculating what it must cost to live there. But not something so ostentatious that it looks fake," I added. "It has to be believable." Danny grinned and tapped one of the photographs with his finger. "Then this is your place." The house in the photograph was stunning. A sprawling colonial revival mansion set on 3 acres of carefully landscaped grounds, with tall columns and expansive windows, and the kind of circular driveway that belonged in magazines. It looked like the kind of place where senators lived, or tech billionaires, or people who had never worried about money a single day in their lives. "It's been on the market for 2 years, Danny explained. "The owners moved to Florida and they're getting desperate to sell, which means they're very motivated to work with potential renters while they wait for a buyer. The asking rent is steep, but for a short-term arrangement, especially something as brief as what you're planning, I think I can negotiate something reasonable." Reasonable was relative, of course. The amount Danny quoted me was more than I'd spent on housing in the previous 2 years combined. But when I thought about Rebecca's face when she realized where she was going to be spending Thanksgiving, it started to seem like a bargain. Patricia Morrison from Elegant Events was a woman closer to my own age, though she'd clearly spent considerably more money on maintaining her appearance than I had. She wore clothes that whispered money rather than shouting it, and her gray hair was styled in a way that probably cost more than I typically spent on haircuts in a year. But she listened to my plan with interest rather than judgment, and her questions were practical rather than skeptical. "The key to pulling this off," she said during our meeting at her downtown office, "is attention to detail. Everything has to be perfect, from the moment they arrive until the moment they leave. If any element feels fake or forced, the whole illusion falls apart." "What do you need from me?" I asked. Patricia smiled, and I caught a glimpse of something that might have been admiration in her eyes. "Mostly, I need you to trust me and be willing to pay for quality. The staff I use for events like this are professionals who know how to maintain character even under pressure. The catering will be flawless, the setup will be seamless, and every detail will be designed to support the story you're trying to tell." "And the story I'm trying to tell is?" "That Joyce Hamilton is a woman of considerable means who has decided to share her good fortune with her family, and who expects to be treated with the respect that her generosity deserves." I signed contracts that week that committed me to expenditures I'd never imagined making. The rental agreement for the mansion, negotiated by Danny at a rate that was merely breathtaking rather than completely ruinous. The event planning contract, with Patricia's company, covering everything from staffing to flowers to the specific brand of champagne that would be served upon arrival. The catering contract for a Thanksgiving dinner that would make Rebecca's perfect meal look like a church potluck by comparison. Each signature felt like a small act of rebellion, a declaration that Joyce Hamilton was not, in fact, the disposable old woman that Rebecca seemed to think she was. Between meetings and contracts and planning sessions, I had to maintain the true facade of normalcy. Michael called twice during those weeks, brief conversations that felt stilted and awkward. He asked how I was doing, told me about work, mentioned that he and Rebecca were thinking about taking a winter vacation somewhere warm. He didn't mention Thanksgiving, and neither did I. We both seemed to understand that the subject was too fraught to approach directly, at least not yet. Rebecca didn't call at all, which didn't surprise me. In her mind, the Thanksgiving incident was probably already forgotten, filed away as a minor inconvenience that had been handled efficiently. She'd gotten what she wanted, her perfect dinner, party for her important business contacts, and my comfort had been irrelevant to that goal. I doubted she'd given me a second thought since I'd driven away that Friday morning. That assumption was about to cost her dearly. Sarah called more frequently, checking on me with the persistence of someone who knew her mother well enough to sense when something was brewing. "You sound different," she said during one of our conversations. "Not upset anymore, but something else." "What are you up to, Mom?" "I'm not up to anything," I said, which was technically true. I wasn't up to anything yet. But I was planning something, and the planning was energizing me in a way I hadn't felt in years. "You're being evasive, which means you're definitely up to something." "Should I be worried?" I considered the question seriously. Should she be worried? I was about to spend a significant portion of my retirement savings on what amounted to an elaborate practical joke. I was planning to deceive my son and his wife in a way that would probably damage our already strained relationship even further. I was risking my financial security for the sake of making a point that could probably be made in less expensive ways. "I don't think so," I said finally. "But I might need you to trust me for a while, even if what I'm doing doesn't make sense. From the outside." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Does this have to do with what happened at Thanksgiving?" "It has to do with a lot of things," I said. "But yes, that's part of it." "Good," she said, surprising me with the vehemence in her voice. "That woman needs to learn some manners, and Michael needs to remember who raised him." 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, I made the call that would set everything in motion. Michael answered on the third ring, and I could hear the television in the background. Some sports show, probably football highlights. "Hey, Mom, how are you?" "Doing?" "I'm doing well, sweetheart. Really well, actually. Better than I have in a long time." "That's great to hear. You sound good." "I feel good. In fact, I feel good enough that I want to do something special for Thanksgiving this year." I heard the television volume decrease, which meant I had his attention. "Oh yeah? What did you have in mind?" "I want to host this year. I want to have you and Rebecca over to my place for Thanksgiving dinner." The silence that followed was long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. "Mom, that's really sweet of you, but your apartment is pretty small for hosting, and Rebecca's already started planning our menu and everything." "I'm not talking about my apartment," I said, letting a note of amusement creep into my voice. "I'm talking about my new place." "Your new place?" "I've made some changes recently, Michael. Some big changes. I have a new house, and I'd love to share it with my family." Another long silence. I could almost hear him trying to process this information, trying to figure out how his retired schoolteacher mother had suddenly acquired a new house. "Mom, what are you talking about? What new house? When did you buy a house?" "It's a recent development," I said, which was true in the most literal sense. "And I'm very excited to show it to you, both of you." "I don't understand. How did you afford a new house? Did you take out a loan? Mom, please tell me you didn't do something financially irresponsible." The concern in his voice was touching, though it was about 30 years too late. I'd been making my own financial decisions since he was in diapers, and I'd managed to raise 3 children and accumulate a comfortable retirement fund without his guidance. "Don't worry about the financial details, sweetheart. Just trust that your mother knows what she's doing. I want to have Thanksgiving at my new place, and I want you both to be there." "But Rebecca's already bought the turkey, and she's invited the Johnsons again, and—" "The Johnsons can have Thanksgiving at their own house this year," I said firmly. "This is family time, Michael. Just the 3 of us." I could hear muffled conversation in the background, Rebecca's voice asking who was on the phone. Michael, explaining what I'd just told him. I couldn't make out her words, but her tone was clearly skeptical. "Mom, Rebecca wants to know where this new house is. She's having trouble understanding how you could afford to move without mentioning it to anyone. Tell Rebecca that all will be revealed on Thanksgiving Day. I'll text you the address, and I'd like you both here at 3 o'clock. I promise you'll find it interesting. Mom, this is all very mysterious. Are you sure you're okay? You're not having some kind of episode or anything? An episode. As if the idea of Joyce Hamilton having resources or making independent decisions was so unlikely that it suggested mental illness. I'm perfectly fine, Michael. In fact, I'm better than fine. I'm excited. It's been a long time since I've had something to be excited about. We talked for a few more minutes, Michael pressing for details that I declined to provide, me reassuring him that I was mentally competent and financially responsible, and very much looking forward to seeing them both on Thanksgiving Day. When I finally hung up, I felt a surge of satisfaction that I hadn't experienced since I'd been teaching. There's something deeply gratifying about knowing something that other people don't know, especially when that knowledge is going to result in a lesson that's long overdue. Margaret called an hour later, having apparently received a frantic call from Michael asking if I'd lost my mind. "He's worried about you," she said, though I could hear the laughter in her voice. "He seems to think you've developed delusions of grandeur." "What did you tell him?" "I told him that his mother was full of surprises and that he should probably pay closer attention to the woman who raised him. I also told him that if he was really concerned about your mental state, he should spend more time making sure you're treated with the respect you deserve." "You didn't." "I absolutely did. That boy needed to hear it." I spent the evening looking through the photographs Danny had taken of the mansion, imagining Rebecca's face when she realized where she was going to be spending Thanksgiving. The house was even more impressive in person than it had been in the initial photographs he'd shown me. The grand foyer with its crystal chandelier and marble floors, the formal dining room with its mahogany table that could seat 12 people, comfortably, the living room with its floor-to-ceiling windows and Persian rugs that probably cost more than most people's cars. Patricia's team had done their work well. The house was fully furnished with pieces that looked like they'd been collected over decades by someone with impeccable taste and unlimited resources. There were fresh flowers in every room, carefully selected books on the shelves, and art on the walls that looked museum quality. Every detail had been designed to suggest old money, established wealth, the kind of comfortable luxury that came from generations of financial security. It was exactly the kind of house where Rebecca would expect to be treated as an honored guest, the kind of place where she would automatically assume she belonged. And it was the perfect setting for the lesson I was about to teach her about assumptions and respect and the consequences of treating people as less than human. The week before Thanksgiving, I moved into the mansion temporarily, partly to make sure everything was perfect and partly to get comfortable with the role I was about to play. Patricia's staff treated me with the kind of deference usually reserved for actual wealthy clients, calling me Mrs. Hamilton and asking about my preferences for everything from the thread count on the linens to the brand of soap in the guest bathrooms. I found myself enjoying the performance more than I'd expected. There was something liberating about being treated as someone important, someone whose comfort and preferences mattered. The staff anticipated my needs, took care of problems, before I even knew they existed, and made me feel like the most important person in their world. It was, I realized, exactly the opposite of how I'd been treated at my son's house on Thanksgiving. The day before Thanksgiving, I had my final meeting with Patricia to go over the timeline and make sure every detail was perfect. "The car service will pick them up at 2:30, she said, reading from her checklist. "That gives us time to make any last-minute adjustments before they arrive. The staff will be in position. The dinner will be ready to serve whenever you give the signal. And we'll have champagne ready the moment they walk through the door." "And the sleeping arrangements?" Patricia's smile was sharp. "Everything is exactly as you requested. The guest room is prepared to look like it's being renovated, with dust sheets and construction materials strategically placed. The master suite is clearly yours, and the living room is set up as if it's being used for storage while the renovations are in progress. Which leaves the garage, just as you specified, complete with a daybed and some blankets. Exactly like what you described from your experience at their house. I felt a flicker of something that might have been doubt. This was elaborate, expensive, and potentially devastating to my relationship with Michael. Was I really prepared to go through with it? Was the satisfaction of revenge worth the cost? In money and family harmony? Then I remembered the sound of their laughter through the walls while I tried to fall asleep in their garage, and the doubt disappeared. Perfect, I said. Let's give them a Thanksgiving they'll never forget. The morning of Thanksgiving dawned clear and cold, with the kind of brilliant blue sky that made everything look sharp and crystalline. I stood at the window of the master bedroom in my temporary mansion, looking out at grounds that would have made a country club jealous, and felt a calm settle over me that I hadn't experienced in weeks. Today was the day that Becca Hamilton learned what it felt like to be disposable. Patricia arrived at noon with her final team, making last-minute adjustments to the flower arrangements, polishing already spotless surfaces, and ensuring that every element of the illusion was perfect. The staff moved through the house with quiet efficiency, disappearing into the background so completely that it was easy to forget they were there. "You look lovely," Patricia said, appraising my outfit. I'd chosen a cashmere dress in deep burgundy, paired with pearls that had been my mother's, and shoes that had cost more than I usually spent on clothes in 6 months. The whole ensemble was designed to suggest understated wealth, the kind of quiet luxury that didn't need to announce itself. "I feel like I'm wearing a costume," I admitted. "You are," Patricia replied. "But sometimes we need costumes to become the people we're meant to be." At 2:00, I received a text from the car service confirming that they'd picked up Michael and Rebecca and were en route. The drive from their house to the mansion would take about 20 minutes, which gave me just enough time to settle into character and prepare for the performance of my life. I positioned myself in the grand foyer, where the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows would create the most dramatic effect. The crystal chandelier cast rainbow prisms across the marble floor, and the fresh flowers filled the space, with a subtle perfume that suggested money and taste in equal measure. At exactly 3:00, I heard the crunch of tires on the circular gravel driveway. Through the window, I watched my son and daughter-in-law climb out of a black sedan that looked expensive enough to belong in this setting. Rebecca was dressed in what I recognized as her most formal outfit, a tailored coat and heels that clicked authoritatively on the stone walkway. Michael looked nervous, constantly glancing around as if he was trying to solve a puzzle that didn't make sense. The doorbell rang, and I took a deep breath. Class was about to begin. I opened the massive oak door with what I hoped was the perfect expression of warm welcome mixed with casual affluence. The kind of smile that suggested this level of luxury was simply my normal, everyday existence. "Michael, Rebecca, you made it." My son stood frozen on the threshold, his mouth slightly open as he took in the marble foyer behind me. His eyes traveled from the crystal chandelier overhead to the sweeping staircase with its polished mahogany banister, to the oil paintings that lined the walls in gilt frames that caught the afternoon light. Rebecca's reaction was more controlled, but I caught the flicker of surprise that crossed her face before she schooled her features into polite interest. She was clearly trying to process what she was seeing, to reconcile the woman who had slept in her garage with the woman who apparently owned a mansion that belonged in Architectural Digest. "Mom," Michael said slowly, wow, this is really your place?" Come in, I said, stepping aside and gesturing them into the foyer. "You'll catch cold standing there gawking." They stepped inside, and I watched Rebecca's eyes make a quick, practiced assessment of everything around her. I could almost see her calculating the value of the chandelier, the cost of the marble flooring, the price tag on the Persian runner that stretched down the hallway. Her expression was carefully neutral, but there was something predatory in the way she cataloged each expensive detail. "Mrs. Hamilton," said James, the butler Patricia had provided for the occasion, appearing as if from nowhere, with a silver tray bearing crystal flutes filled with champagne. "Your guests have arrived." Rebecca's eyebrows rose slightly at the formal address, and I saw her take note of the fact that I apparently employed household staff. James was perfectly cast for the role, a distinguished man in his 60s who carried himself with the quiet authority that came from years of serving wealthy families. "Thank you, James. This is my son Michael and his wife Rebecca." "A pleasure to meet you both," James said with precisely the right degree of deference. "Mrs. Hamilton has been looking forward to your visit." Michael accepted a glass of champagne, with the slightly dazed expression of someone who was still trying to understand what was happening. Rebecca took hers with more composure, but I noticed the way her fingers lingered on the crystal, feeling its weight and quality. "Mom, I have to ask," Michael said, looking around the foyer again. "How did you afford all this? I mean, it's beautiful, but on a teacher's pension." "Oh, sweetie," I said with a laugh that I hoped sounded both mysterious and slightly condescending. "There are a lot of things you don't know about your old mother's finances. I've been very careful with my investments over the years, and some of them have paid off quite handsomely." It wasn't entirely a lie. I had been careful with my investments, and some of them had indeed paid off well. Just not well enough to actually afford a mansion like this one. Rebecca's interest sharpened visibly. "What kind of investments?" she asked, and I could hear the calculation in her voice. If Joyce Hamilton had money, real money, then the dynamics of their relationship were about to change significantly. "Oh, this and that," I said airily. "Tech stocks mostly. Bought them years ago when everyone thought I was crazy. A little real estate here and there. You know how it is." I didn't know how it was, actually, since I'd never had enough money to play in those markets in any meaningful way. But Rebecca clearly knew how it was, and I could see her mind working, reassessing everything she thought she knew about me. "Let me show you around," I continued, linking my arm through Michael's. "I'm so excited to share this with family." The tour I gave them was a masterpiece of subtle intimidation. I led them through room after room of carefully curated luxury, each space designed to reinforce the impression that I was a woman of considerable means who had simply been hiding it well. The library with its floor-to-ceiling bookcases and leather-bound first editions. The music room with its baby grand piano and antique violin displayed in a glass case. The conservatory with its exotic plants and fountain that tinkled softly in the background. Michael's amazement was genuine and touching. He kept shaking his head and muttering things like, "I can't believe this," and "Mom, this is incredible." His wonder was that of a child discovering that his ordinary mother was actually secretly remarkable. And despite everything that had brought us to this moment, I felt a surge of affection for him. Rebecca's reaction was more complex. She was clearly impressed, but there was something else underlying her admiration. A kind of hungry assessment, as if she was already mentally rearranging the furniture to suit her own tastes. More than once, I caught her touching surfaces, testing the quality of fabrics, examining pieces with the eye of someone who understood value. "This painting," she said, stopping in front of a landscape that Patricia had assured me looked appropriately expensive. "It's exquisite. Is it an original?" "Oh, yes," I said casually. "I picked it up at an auction in New York last spring. I have a weakness for the Hudson River School painters." I had no idea if the painting was actually from the Hudson River School, but it sounded like the kind of thing a wealthy art collector might say. Rebecca nodded appreciatively, clearly filing the information away for future reference. "And this piano," Michael said, running his fingers along the polished surface of the baby grand. "Do you play?" "I'm learning," I lied smoothly. At my age, it seemed like the perfect time to take up new hobbies. I have a wonderful instructor who comes twice a week. The lies came surprisingly easily, perhaps because I was beginning to enjoy the character I was playing. This version of Joyce Hamilton was confident, successful, and completely in control of her environment. She was everything the real Joyce Hamilton had sometimes wished she could be. "The dining room is through here," I said, leading them toward the back of the house. "I thought we'd have a more intimate meal today, just the three of us." The dining room was spectacular, dominated by a mahogany table that could have seated a small army but was set today for three, with china that looked like it belonged in a museum. Crystal glasses caught the light from the chandelier overhead, and silver candlesticks flanked a centerpiece of autumn flowers that probably cost more than I usually spent on groceries in a month. "This is where we'll be dining," I announced, watching their faces as they took in the formal splendor of the room. "It's incredible, Mom," Michael said, and I could hear the genuine awe in his voice. "I still can't believe you've been keeping this secret. How long have you lived here?" "Oh, not long," I said vaguely. "I wanted to get settled before I started having guests. You know how it is when you move into a new place. Everything's chaos until you get organized." Rebecca was examining the china pattern with the focused attention of someone who understood quality. "This is Spode, isn't it? The blue Italian pattern?" I had no idea what pattern it was, but I nodded as if I'd personally selected it from dozens of equally expensive options. I've always loved classic patterns. They never go out of style. "It's beautiful," Rebecca said, and for the first time since they'd arrived, her tone held genuine warmth. "You have exquisite taste, Joyce." Joyce. Not Mrs. Hamilton, not Michael's mother, but Joyce. It was amazing how a little apparent wealth could transform someone from an inconvenience to be managed into a person worthy of respect and consideration. "Shall we have a drink in the living room before dinner?" I suggested. "James will let us know when everything's ready." The living room was the crown jewel of the house, a space that managed to be both impressive and comfortable. Deep sofas, upholstered in silk, surrounded a coffee table made from what appeared to be a single slab of marble, and the walls were lined with more artwork that suggested both taste and deep pockets. French doors opened onto a terrace that overlooked the manicured grounds, and a fire crackled cheerfully in the massive stone fireplace. We settled into the seating arrangement, Michael and Rebecca on one sofa, me in the wing chair that positioned me perfectly to observe their reactions. James appeared again with fresh drinks and a selection of appetizers that looked like they'd been crafted by someone with serious culinary training. "This is all so lovely," Rebecca said, and I could hear a new note in her voice. Something that might have been respect or calculation, or both. "I have to admit, Joyce, I'm curious about how you managed to keep this side of your life such a secret." "Not secret exactly," I said, taking a delicate sip of what was probably very expensive wine. "More like private. I've always believed that true class is about understatement, don't you think? People who feel the need to flaunt their wealth usually don't have as much as they want others to believe." It was a pointed comment, delivered with just enough sweetness to make it sound like a general observation rather than a personal criticism. But I saw Rebecca's eyes narrow slightly, as if she wasn't quite sure whether she'd been insulted. "Of course," she said smoothly. "I completely agree. Discretion is so much more elegant than ostentation." Michael, bless him, seemed oblivious to the undercurrents in the conversation. He was still looking around the room with wonder, occasionally shaking his head as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. "I keep thinking about all the times I worried about you," he said. "About whether you had enough money, whether you were comfortable in that little apartment, and here you are living like—" "Like what?" I asked, genuinely curious to hear how he'd finish that sentence. "Like royalty," he said with a laugh. "I mean, this place is incredible, Mom. It's like something out of a movie." A movie. That was more accurate than he realized, since this was indeed a performance. complete with props and supporting actors and a carefully scripted narrative designed to create a specific emotional response. "Well," I said, rising from my chair, "let me show you to your room so you can freshen up before dinner. I know the drive was long." I led them upstairs, where Patricia's team had created 2 guest spaces that reinforced the impression of wealth and taste. The first room, which I showed to Michael, was decorated in deep blues and rich woods, with a 4-poster bed and antique furniture that looked like it had been in the family for generations. "This is beautiful, Mom," Michael said, setting his overnight bag on the luggage rack that had been positioned precisely where a well-trained staff member would have placed it. "I feel like I'm staying in a 5-star hotel." "I want you to be comfortable," I said, meaning it more than he probably realized. Despite everything that had happened between us, despite the disappointment and hurt, I did want my son to be comfortable. I wanted him to feel welcome and valued and loved. The question was whether he would extend the same courtesy to others. Rebecca's room was across the hall, decorated in softer colors, but with the same attention to luxury and detail. She examined everything with the thoroughness of someone conducting an appraisal, touching fabrics, testing the firmness of the mattress, checking the thread count on the linens. "This is lovely, Joyce," she said, but I caught her looking at the adjoining bathroom with something that might have been envy. "You've really created something special here." "I'm glad you approve," I said. "Why don't you both take some time to settle in, and we'll meet back downstairs in about an hour for dinner." I left them to explore their accommodations and made my way back downstairs where James was waiting with an update on the dinner preparations. "Everything is proceeding on schedule, Mrs. Hamilton," he said. "Chef Rodriguez expects to begin serving at 6:30, unless you prefer a different time." "6:30 is perfect," I said. "And the other arrangements we discussed?" "All in place, exactly as you specified." I spent the next hour in what I'd begun thinking of as the calm before the storm. I wandered through the rooms I'd been temporarily calling home, admiring again the skill with which Patricia's team had created this illusion of wealth and sophistication. Every detail was perfect, from the fresh flowers that were replaced daily, to the books on the shelves that looked like they'd been read and reread by someone with serious literary tastes. At exactly 6:30, James appeared to announce that dinner was served. I collected Michael and Rebecca from their rooms, noting that Rebecca had changed into a dress that was clearly her most expensive, and we made our way to the dining room. The meal that followed was a masterpiece of culinary artistry. Course after course appeared as if by magic, each dish more elegant and complex than the last. The wine pairings were perfect, the service was invisible, and the conversation flowed, with the kind of ease that comes when everyone is making an effort to be charming. Rebecca, in particular, seemed determined to be the perfect guest. She complimented every dish, asked intelligent questions about the wine, and regaled us with stories that showcased her sophistication and worldliness. It was a performance designed to demonstrate that she belonged in this rarefied atmosphere, that she was the kind of person who could appreciate and deserve this level of luxury. Michael was more relaxed than I'd seen him in years. The wine and the elegant surroundings seemed to have loosened something in him, and he told stories about his childhood that I hadn't heard him mention in decades. For moments at a time, I could see the boy he'd been, the one who had been eager to please and quick to laugh and utterly devoted to his mother. "I still can't get over this," he said as dessert arrived, a confection that looked too beautiful to eat. "It's like discovering that Clark Kent is really Superman. My ordinary mom turns out to be this sophisticated woman of mystery. I prefer to think of it as finally having the resources to live the way I always wanted to," I said. "It's amazing what a difference money makes in how people see you." Rebecca's fork paused halfway to her mouth, and I saw her eyes flick to mine. There was something sharp in her gaze, as if she was trying to determine whether that comment had been aimed at her. "Money certainly provides opportunities," she said carefully, but I've always believed that true elegance comes from within, regardless of one's financial circumstances. It was a diplomatic response, but there was an edge to it that suggested she'd caught the implication of my words. Oh, absolutely, I agreed. Though it's interesting how much easier it is to display that inner elegance when you have the external resources to support it. A designer dress always photographs better than something from a discount store, don't you think? The comment hung in the air between us, and I could see Rebecca processing it, trying to decide whether I was making a general observation or a specific criticism. Michael, still oblivious to the subtext, raised his wine glass in a toast. "To Mom," he said, "for surprising us all and for giving us a Thanksgiving we'll never forget." "To surprises," I agreed, raising my own glass. "And to never forgetting important lessons." We finished dessert as the sun was setting outside the French doors, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured grounds. James appeared to clear the table, and I suggested we adjourn to the living room for coffee and after-dinner drinks. "Actually," I said as we settled back into the comfortable seating arrangement, "I should probably address the sleeping arrangements for tonight." Michael looked up from his brandy snifter with mild interest. "Oh, right. Are we staying in those rooms you showed us earlier?" "Well," I said, adopting the same tone of regretful inconvenience that Rebecca had used on me, "there's been a slight complication with the guest accommodations." Rebecca's posture straightened slightly, and I saw her exchange a glance with Michael. "What kind of complication?" she asked. "The contractors were supposed to finish the renovations in Michael's room yesterday, but they've run into some delays. Something about a problem with the electrical work that needs to be sorted out before it's safe to sleep in there." Michael's face showed confusion. "But the room looked fine when you showed it to us earlier." "Oh, the main part of the room is finished," I said airily. "But there are some issues with the adjoining bathroom that make it uninhabitable. You know how these old houses are, always something that needs attention." It was fascinating to watch Rebecca's expression as she realized where this conversation was heading. I could see her mental calculations, her assessment of the available alternatives, her growing understanding that the perfect evening might not end as comfortably as she'd expected. "What about my room?" she asked, and I heard the first note of concern creeping into her voice. "Well, that's the other issue," I said with what I hoped was convincing embarrassment. "The room I showed you is actually my office, and I have some very important documents laid out in there for a business meeting tomorrow morning. I really can't have anyone sleeping in there tonight." "So where exactly are we supposed to sleep?" Rebecca asked, and her tone was becoming decidedly less gracious. I paused, as if considering the available options for the first time. "Let me think," I said slowly. "The master suite is obviously mine. The guest room is uninhabitable due to the electrical issues. The office can't be disturbed. The living room." I glanced around the elegant space, with its silk upholstery and priceless artwork. "I really can't have anyone sleeping in here. The insurance, you understand. Some of these pieces are quite valuable, and the policy is very specific about overnight guests in the public areas of the house." Rebecca's eyes were beginning to show something that might have been panic. "Joyce, surely there must be somewhere." "Oh," I said, as if struck by sudden inspiration. "I know, the garage." The word hung in the air like a physical presence, and I watched both of their faces as they processed what I'd just suggested. "The garage?" Michael repeated slowly. "It's heated," I said quickly, adopting the same tone of helpful enthusiasm that Rebecca had used when suggesting the same solution to me. "And I have a very comfortable daybed out there that I sometimes use when I want to get away from everything. It's really quite cozy." Rebecca's face had gone pale, and I could see her struggling to maintain her composure. "You want us to sleep in the garage?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. "Well, not both of you," I said reasonably. "The daybed is only big enough for one person. Michael can take the sofa in my study, it's quite comfortable. But Rebecca, I think you'd find the garage arrangement much more private. The silence that followed was profound. I could hear the clock ticking on the mantelpiece, the soft crackle of the fire, the distant sound of James clearing the dinner, dishes in the kitchen. Rebecca stared at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, while Michael looked confused and increasingly uncomfortable. "Mom," Michael said finally, "I think there might be some misunderstanding here. Rebecca can't sleep in the garage." "Why not?" I asked, maintaining an expression of innocent confusion. "It's perfectly warm and dry, and the daybed is really quite comfortable. I wouldn't suggest it if I didn't think it was adequate." Rebecca found her voice at last, though it was strained with the effort of remaining polite. "Joyce, I appreciate your hospitality, but sleeping in a garage is simply not acceptable. Perhaps we should just drive home tonight instead." "Oh, but you can't do that," I said with apparent concern. "You've both been drinking wine with dinner, and it's dark outside. It would be terribly unsafe." Michael was looking back and forth between his wife and his mother with growing alarm, finally beginning to sense that something was happening that he didn't understand. "Mom? What's going on here? Why are you suggesting that Rebecca sleep in the garage?" I looked at him with surprise, as if the question was unexpected. "I'm not suggesting anything unreasonable, sweetie. I'm simply working with the accommodations I have available. Sometimes when you're hosting overnight guests, you have to make do with less than ideal arrangements." The irony was so thick I could taste it, but Michael still didn't seem to grasp what was happening. Rebecca, however, was beginning to understand. "This is about Thanksgiving, isn't it?" she said quietly. I tilted my head as if I didn't understand what she meant. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," I said. "This is Thanksgiving. We just had a lovely dinner together." "No," Rebecca said, her voice growing stronger. "This is about Thanksgiving at our house. This is about the garage." Michael's face went through a series of expressions as understanding finally dawned. Horror, embarrassment, recognition, and something that might have been shame all flickered across his features in rapid succession. "Mom," he said slowly, "you're not seriously trying to make Rebecca sleep in your garage because of what happened at our house." "I'm not trying to make anyone do anything," I said with perfect reasonableness. "I'm simply explaining the available accommodations, just like Rebecca explained them to me." Rebecca stood up abruptly, her composure finally cracking. "This is ridiculous," she said. "I'm not sleeping in a garage, and I'm not staying here to be humiliated like this." "Humiliated?" I repeated, allowing surprise to color my voice. "Rebecca, I'm offering you a warm, dry place to sleep. How is that?" "Humiliating? You know exactly how it's humiliating," she snapped. And for the first time since I'd known her, the polished veneer had completely disappeared. "This whole evening has been some elaborate setup to get revenge for Thanksgiving." "Revenge?" "Is such an ugly word," I said mildly. "I prefer to think of it as education." Michael was standing now too, running his hands through his hair in a gesture I remembered from his childhood when he was trying to solve a problem that seemed too big for him. "Mom, please, can't we just put this behind us? Can't we move forward?" "Of course we can, sweetheart," I said. "Right after Rebecca spends one night sleeping in the garage. Then we'll all understand what it feels like to be treated like we don't matter." Rebecca's face was flushed with anger and humiliation, and I felt a moment of something that might have been sympathy. But then I remembered the cold concrete floor, the smell of motor oil, the sound of their laughter while I tried to fall. Asleep surrounded by garbage cans, and the sympathy disappeared. "I won't do it," Rebecca said firmly. "I don't care what point you're trying to make. I won't be humiliated like this." I nodded as if her response was perfectly reasonable. "That's your choice, of course," I said. "Just like it was my choice to accept your hospitality when you offered me the garage. The difference is, I was gracious about it." The standoff continued for several more minutes, with Rebecca insisting she wouldn't sleep in the garage. Michael, trying to broker some kind of compromise, and me maintaining that the garage was the only available accommodation. Finally, Rebecca announced that she was calling a car service to take them home, regardless of the late hour and the wine they'd consumed. That's certainly an option, I agreed. Though I think it's a shame to end such a lovely evening on an unpleasant note. As they gathered their things and waited for their ride, I maintained the perfect facade of a gracious hostess who was puzzled by her guests' sudden decision to leave. I walked them to the door, thanked them for coming, and expressed hope that we could do it again soon. Rebecca said nothing as she left, her face set in lines of cold fury. Michael hugged me goodbye, but I could feel the tension in his body, the confusion and disappointment that he didn't quite know how to express. "Mom," he said quietly as their car pulled up the circular drive, "I hope you feel like this was worth it." I watched them drive away from the doorway of my temporary mansion, standing under the crystal chandelier in the marble foyer that had been mine for one perfect day. The silence that followed their departure was profound, broken only by the sound of James beginning to clear the remnants of our Thanksgiving dinner. Did I feel like it was worth it? That was the question I would be asking myself for a long time to come. The silence in the mansion after they left was deafening. I stood in that opulent foyer, surrounded by all the trappings of wealth and success, and felt oddly empty. The crystal chandelier cast the same elegant light, the marble floors gleamed with the same polish, but something had fundamentally shifted in the atmosphere. James appeared beside me with the quiet efficiency that had marked his service throughout the evening. "Shall I begin closing the house for the evening, Mrs. Hamilton?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. If he had opinions about what had just transpired, his professionalism prevented him from expressing them. "Yes, please," I said, my voice sounding strange in my own ears. "And James? Thank you for everything tonight. Your performance was flawless." He inclined his head slightly. "It was my pleasure, Mrs. Hamilton. Will you be needing anything else before we depart?" The question reminded me that this was all temporary, that in a few hours I would be returning to my modest apartment and my ordinary life, leaving behind this fairy tale of wealth and power like Cinderella fleeing the ball at midnight. "No. I think I'm all set. Patricia's team can handle the rest tomorrow." After James left, I found myself wandering through the rooms that had been mine for such a brief time. In the dining room, the table still bore the remnants of our interrupted dinner, crystal glasses half empty, napkins thrown carelessly aside when Rebecca had stood up in anger. The flowers still perfumed the air, but their fragrance seemed cloying, now too sweet for the bitter taste the evening had left in my mouth. I poured myself a glass of wine from the bottle we'd been sharing and settled into the wing chair in the living room where I'd orchestrated the entire confrontation. The fire was dying in the fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and I found myself replaying the evening over and over in my mind. Had I gotten what I wanted? Rebecca had certainly experienced the humiliation of being offered substandard accommodations, of being made to feel unwelcome and unimportant. She had felt the sting of having her comfort treated as an afterthought, her dignity dismissed as irrelevant. In that sense, my plan had worked perfectly, but watching her face when she realized what was happening, seeing the anger and hurt and genuine shock in her eyes, I had felt something I hadn't expected, a flicker of recognition. For just a moment, I had seen myself reflected in her expression, the same confusion and disbelief I had felt when she first suggested I sleep in their garage. The difference was that Rebecca had refused. She had stood up for herself, declared the treatment unacceptable, and walked away rather than submit to the indignity. She had done what I should have done, what I wished I had done, but what my upbringing and my desire to maintain family harmony had prevented me from doing. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I glanced at the screen to see Michael's name. "Mom, we need to talk. This can't be how things end between us." I stared at the message for a long time before responding. What was there to say? That I was sorry for humiliating his wife, that I regretted showing them both what it felt like to be treated as less than human, that I wished I could take back the lesson I had spent so much time and money to teach. "You're right," I typed back. "Come by my apartment tomorrow afternoon. We'll talk then." "Your apartment? What about the house?" I hesitated before answering. The truth was complicated, and I wasn't sure I was ready to reveal just how complicated it was. "We'll talk tomorrow," I repeated, and then turned off my phone. I spent one more night in the mansion, sleeping in the luxurious master bedroom with its Egyptian cotton sheets and down pillows that felt like clouds. But my sleep was restless, filled with dreams where I was simultaneously the powerful woman, dispensing justice, and the humiliated mother sleeping in a garage. I woke several times during the night, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings, before remembering where I was and why. The next morning, Patricia arrived early with her cleanup crew, efficient as always in dismantling the elaborate production we had created. "How did it go?" she asked, as her team began removing the fresh flowers and packing away the rental furniture that had completed the illusion. "Exactly as planned," I said, though even as I said it, I wasn't sure whether that was a good thing or a disaster. Patricia studied my face with the shrewd assessment of someone who had orchestrated many dramatic events and understood the emotional cost they could exact. "Second thoughts?" she asked gently. "More like first thoughts," I admitted. I was so focused on the planning and the execution that I didn't really consider what would happen afterward. "And what is happening afterward?" I watched her team carefully wrapping the artwork that had made the walls look like those of a serious collector, each piece probably worth more than I made in a year when I was teaching. "I'm not sure yet. My son wants to talk, which probably means he wants to understand why his mother turned into someone he doesn't recognize." "Did you turn into someone he doesn't recognize?" Patricia asked. "Or did you just show him a side of yourself that he'd never bothered to see before?" It was a good question, one I wasn't sure I could answer. The woman who had stood in that foyer last night, coolly offering her daughter-in-law a bed in the garage, had felt both completely foreign and utterly familiar. She was someone I might have been if circumstances had been different, if I'd had more money and power and fewer reasons to accept unacceptable treatment. "I think," I said slowly, "I showed him what I'm capable of when I stopped caring more about keeping peace than demanding respect." Patricia nodded approvingly. "That's usually a lesson worth teaching, even when it's expensive." By noon, the mansion had been restored to its original state, ready for Patricia's team to return it to its owners. I packed my overnight bag with the same clothes I'd brought, but I felt like a completely different person than the one who had arrived 2 days earlier. The drive back to my apartment was strange, like traveling backward through time from a fantasy into reality. The mansion disappeared behind me, along with the crystal chandeliers and marble floors and the heady sense of power that came with unlimited resources. By the time I pulled into the parking lot of my modest complex, I was Joyce Hamilton, the retired schoolteacher again, living on a pension and worrying about the dent this adventure had put in my savings. But I was also Joyce Hamilton, who had shown her family that she was not someone to be trifled with, who had demonstrated that actions have consequences, and who had proven that underestimating her was a mistake that came with a price. I spent the morning cleaning my apartment and preparing for Michael's visit. It felt strange to be back in my small space after the grandeur of the mansion, like putting on old clothes after wearing a designer gown. But it also felt honest in a way that the mansion hadn't. This was my real life. These were my actual possessions. And this was the woman I actually was, rather than the character I had played for one perfect evening. Michael arrived at exactly 2 o'clock, punctual as always. He looked tired, older somehow than he had just yesterday, and I wondered if our confrontation had cost him as much sleep as it had cost me. "Hi, Mom," he said, accepting the cup of Coffee, I offered, and settling onto my familiar couch. This feels weird after last night. I imagine it does, I said, taking the chair across from him. I imagine a lot of things feel weird after last night. He was quiet for a moment, staring into his coffee cup as if it might contain answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. I need to understand what happened, he said finally. Not just last night, but all of it. The house, the money, the whole elaborate setup. I need to understand why you felt like you had to do that. I had been thinking about this conversation since I'd woken up, trying to decide how much to tell him, and how to explain choices that I wasn't entirely sure I understood myself. Do you remember what it felt like? I asked carefully. When Rebecca suggested I sleep in your garage? Mom, I know that was wrong. I knew it was wrong at the time, and I should have said something. I should have stood up for you. But you didn't. No, I didn't. And I'm sorry for that, I really am. But does that justify what you did last night? Does my failure to protect you mean you had the right to humiliate Rebecca the way you did? It was a fair question, one I had been asking myself since they'd driven away from the mansion. I don't know if it was justified, I said honestly, but I know it was necessary. Necessary how? I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot where my neighbors lived their ordinary lives, unencumbered by crystal, chandeliers, and revenge fantasies. Michael, do you know what it's like to be 73 years old and suddenly realize that your own son sees you as disposable? I don't see you as disposable. Then why did you let your wife treat me like I was? The question hung between us, heavy with years of accumulated disappointment and hurt that went far beyond one Thanksgiving evening. Because I was trying to keep peace in my marriage, he said quietly. Because Rebecca had put a lot of work into that dinner, and I thought if I just went along with her plan, everyone would be happy. Everyone except your mother. Everyone except my mother, he agreed. And that was wrong, and I know it was wrong. But Mom, what you did last night was... He trailed off, searching for words. What? Cruel? Vindictive? Over the top? All of those things, he said. But also something else. It was like you became someone I didn't recognize. The elaborate house, the lies about being wealthy, the careful way you orchestrated everything to maximum humiliation. That's not the mother who raised me. I turned back to face him, seeing my youngest child struggling to reconcile the woman he thought he knew with the woman who had appeared in his life like an avenging angel with a taste for expensive wine. Maybe, I said, the mother who raised you was tired of being taken for granted. Is that what this was about? Feeling taken for granted? Partly, but mostly it was about respect, Michael. It was about being treated like a human being whose comfort and dignity matter. He was quiet again, processing this. When he spoke, his voice was smaller, younger, like the boy he'd been when he used to curl up next to me during thunderstorms. I messed up, didn't I? I really messed up. You made choices, I said gently. Choices have consequences. Sometimes, those consequences are lessons we didn't expect to learn. What about Rebecca? What consequences is she facing? That was a more complicated question. I had set out to teach Rebecca a lesson about treating people with respect, but I wasn't sure what she had actually learned from the experience. I don't know, I admitted. She might have learned to think twice before dismissing people as unimportant, or she might have just learned that I'm someone to be avoided in the future. She's pretty angry, Michael said. She feels like you deliberately deceived her, made her look foolish. And how do you think I felt when she made me sleep in your garage? Do you think she considered my feelings when she was solving her accommodation problem at my expense? Michael winced, recognizing the parallel I was drawing. So this was all about revenge? No, I said, surprised to realize I meant it. It was about education, for both of you. What were you trying to teach us? I sat back down, leaning forward to make sure he understood the importance of what I was about to say. I was trying to teach you that every person deserves basic human dignity, regardless of their age or their financial circumstances or how convenient they are to have around. I was trying to teach Rebecca that treating people badly has consequences, even when those people seem powerless to fight back. And I was trying to teach myself that I don't have to accept unacceptable treatment just to keep peace in the family. Michael absorbed this, his face cycling through expressions of understanding, guilt, and something that might have been admiration. "The house," he said finally. "Tell me about the house. How did you afford it? How long have you been wealthy? Without telling any of us?" This was the moment I had been dreading, the point where I would have to admit that the entire evening had been an elaborate performance funded by my retirement savings and orchestrated by a team of professionals. "I'm not wealthy, Michael," I said quietly. "I rented that house for one night. I hired the staff, I rented the furniture. I created an illusion designed to show both of you what it feels like when someone you've dismissed as unimportant suddenly has power over your comfort." The silence that followed was profound. I watched my son's face as he processed this information, understanding dawning in his eyes as he realized the extent of the deception I had orchestrated. "You rented it?" he said finally. "The whole thing was fake?" "Not fake exactly, temporary. I wanted you both to experience what it felt like to be at the mercy of someone who had the power to make you comfortable or uncomfortable, someone who could treat your dignity as negotiable." "How much did it cost?" I told him, watching his face go pale as he understood the financial sacrifice I had made for the sake of this lesson. "Mom, that's a huge chunk of your savings. Why would you spend that kind of money on something like this?" "Because some lessons are worth whatever they cost," I said, echoing what I had told Margaret weeks earlier. "Because my dignity and my self-respect are worth more than money in the bank." Michael stood up and began pacing my small living room, running his hands through his hair in that familiar gesture of stress and confusion. "I don't understand," he said. "You could have just talked to me. You could have told me how hurt you were, how angry you were about what happened. We could have worked it out without all this elaborate deception." "Could we have?" I asked. "Michael, I did talk to you. I tried to explain how I felt, and you made excuses for Rebecca's behavior. You told me she was overwhelmed, that she didn't mean anything by it, that I should understand how stressful hosting can be. I was trying to keep peace. You were trying to avoid dealing with the problem. There's a difference." He stopped pacing and looked at me directly for the first time since he'd arrived. "So what now? Where do we go from here?" "That depends," I said, "on whether you've learned anything from this experience and on whether you're prepared to make different choices in the future." "What kind of choices?" "The choice to speak up when you see someone being treated badly, even when it's inconvenient. The choice to prioritize basic human decency over social harmony. The choice to remember that your mother is a person whose feelings matter, not just a problem to be managed." Michael sat back down heavily, looking older than his 38 years. "Rebecca wants me to cut contact with you," he said quietly. "She says what you did was unforgivable, that she'll never be able to trust you again." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach, though I had been expecting something like this. "And what do you want to do?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "I love you, Mom. You raised me, you sacrificed for me. You've always been there when I needed you. But I also love my wife, and she's really hurt by what happened." "She's hurt," I repeated. "How do you think I felt when she made me sleep in your garage like I was some vagrant who had wandered in off the street?" "I know you were hurt. I know I failed you, and I'm sorry for that. But two wrongs don't make a right." "No," I agreed. But sometimes it takes a wrong to wake people up to the first wrong they missed. We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us lost in our own thoughts. The afternoon light was fading outside my windows, casting long shadows across my modest living room that bore no resemblance to the opulent spaces I had inhabited just hours earlier. "Can I ask you something?" Michael said finally. "Of course. When you were planning all this, when you were spending your savings and hiring staff and creating this elaborate production, did you think about what it might cost you? Not just financially, but in terms of our relationship?" I considered the question seriously, remembering the weeks of planning and preparation, the excitement I had felt at the prospect of turning the tables on Rebecca, the satisfaction I had anticipated from seeing her experience the same humiliation she had inflicted on me. "I thought about it," I said, "but I decided that a relationship built on my willingness to accept unacceptable treatment wasn't worth preserving." "Even if it meant losing your son?" The question hit me like a physical blow, forcing me to confront the possibility that my quest for justice might have cost me one of the most important relationships in my life. "I hoped," I said carefully, "that my son would choose to build a better relationship rather than lose me entirely." "What would a better relationship look like?" "One where you stand up for me when I need you to. One where my comfort and dignity are considered important, not just optional extras that can be sacrificed for convenience. One where you remember that respect flows both ways, and that being your mother doesn't make me less deserving of basic human decency." Michael was quiet for a long time, staring out my window at the ordinary world beyond. When he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful, like he was working through a problem that didn't have easy answers. "I need to think about all this," he said. "I need to figure out how to move forward in a way that honors both my relationship with you and my marriage to Rebecca." "I understand," I said, though part of me wanted to demand that he choose, that he decide right now whether his mother's dignity was worth defending. "But Mom, I want you to know that what you did last night, as elaborate and expensive and potentially destructive as it was, it made me see something I hadn't seen before." "What's that?" "That you're not just my mother. You're a person with your own needs and feelings and limits, and I've been taking you for granted for way too long." He stood up to leave and I walked him to the door. At the threshold, he turned back to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "The woman who orchestrated last night," he said. "She was pretty formidable. I'm not sure I ever realized my mother had that kind of strength." "Your mother has always had that kind of strength," I replied. "She just usually chose to use it in service of other people's comfort rather than her own." After he left, I sat alone in my apartment as darkness fell outside my windows. The silence was different now, not empty like it had been in the mansion, but full of possibilities I hadn't considered before. My phone rang, and I saw Margaret's name on the screen. "Well," she said without preamble. "How did it go?" I told her everything, from Rebecca's shock at the mansion to Michael's confusion about my motivations, to the conversation we'd just finished about consequences and choices and the price of demanding respect. "Do you regret it?" Margaret asked when I was finished. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "Ask me again in a few months when I see how things shake out." "And if Michael chooses Rebecca's hurt feelings over your dignity, then I'll know where I stand," I said. "And I'll know that I was right to stop accepting unacceptable treatment, even if it cost me more than I wanted to pay." "Joyce Hamilton," Margaret said with something like pride in her voice, "you are one hell of a woman." That night, I made myself a simple dinner and ate it at my small kitchen table, looking through the bills that had accumulated while I was playing mansion owner. The cost of my elaborate lesson was substantial, but not devastating. I would have to be more careful with money for a while, maybe postpone some planned purchases, but I would be fine. More importantly, I felt fine. Not happy exactly, not satisfied in the way I had expected to feel after getting my revenge, but centered in a way I hadn't been in years. I had drawn a line, established a boundary, demanded respect in the most dramatic way possible. Whether it had been worth the cost remained to be seen. But for the first time since that cold night in Michael's garage, I felt like Joyce Hamilton was someone worth respecting. The question now was whether anyone else would reach the same conclusion. 3 weeks passed without a word from Michael. 3 weeks of checking my phone every morning, hoping to see his name on the screen. 3 weeks of jumping every time the telephone rang. 3 weeks of waiting for some sign that my son was ready to bridge the chasm that had opened between us. The silence wasn't entirely unexpected, but it was harder to bear than I had anticipated. I had known that my elaborate lesson might come with a price, but I hadn't fully prepared myself for the possibility that the price might be my relationship with my youngest child. During those quiet days, I found myself second-guessing every choice I had made, every word I had spoken during our confrontation, every moment of the evening that had changed everything between us. Sarah called regularly from Portland, her voice tight with concern as she tried to understand what had happened between her brother and me. I told her the basic facts but kept the more dramatic details to myself, unwilling to put her in the middle of a conflict that was already complicated enough. "He's being ridiculous," she said during one of our conversations. "Whatever you did, it couldn't have been worse than what Rebecca did to you." It wasn't worse, I agreed. But it was different, more intentional, more calculated. I planned what happened to them, while what happened to me was supposedly just poor planning and inconvenience. "You don't really believe that, do you? That Rebecca's treatment of you was accidental?" I considered the question seriously, remembering the look in Rebecca's eyes when she had suggested the garage, the tone of voice that had carried a subtle note of satisfaction, as if she was solving a problem by putting me in my proper place. "No," I said finally. "I don't think it was accidental, but I can't prove that. And even if I could, it doesn't change the fact that I spent a fortune to humiliate her in return." "Good," Sarah said fiercely. "Someone needed to show that woman that actions have consequences." But as the days stretched into weeks, I began to wonder if the consequences I had created were ones I could live with. The satisfaction I had felt, immediately after the confrontation had faded, leaving behind a complex mixture of pride and regret, vindication and loss. I had proven my point, demonstrated my strength, demanded the respect I deserved. I had also potentially destroyed my relationship with Michael and created a family rift that might never heal. The irony wasn't lost on me. In my quest to be treated like family, I might have ended up without a family at all. Margaret stopped by regularly during those weeks, bringing groceries and companionship and a perspective that was both sympathetic and pragmatic. "You did what you felt you had to do," she said one afternoon as we sat in my kitchen sharing tea and store-bought cookies. "Now you have to live with the consequences, just like everyone else involved." "Do you think I was wrong?" I asked. Her directly. "Do you think I went too far?" Margaret was quiet for a moment, considering her words carefully. We had been friends long enough that she knew I wanted honesty, not comfort. "I think," she said slowly, "that you were pushed beyond your limits by people who should have known better. I think you responded in a way that was dramatic and expensive, and probably more elaborate than necessary. But I also think that sometimes dramatic responses are the only ones that get people's attention. And if Michael chooses Rebecca over me, if I never see him again because of what I did, then you'll know that your relationship with him was never as strong as you hoped it was. And you'll know that you were right to stop accepting treatment that no one should have to accept." It wasn't the comfort I had been looking for, but it was the truth I needed to hear. On a gray December morning, exactly 3 weeks after our conversation, my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw Michael standing on my doorstep, looking uncertain and tired. He was alone, and I felt a mixture of relief and apprehension as I opened the door. "Hi, Mom," he said quietly. "Can we talk?" I let him in, noting that he looked like he'd lost weight, that there were new lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. We settled into our familiar positions in my living room, but the easy comfort that had once characterized our relationship was gone, replaced by a careful politeness that felt foreign and sad. "I've been thinking," he said without preamble, "about what you said, about what happened, about what it all means." "And what conclusions have you reached?" "That I owe you an apology," he said. "Not for being angry about what you did to Rebecca, because I still think that was wrong, but for the situation that led to it, for failing to protect you when you needed me to." I felt something loosen in my chest, a knot of tension I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. "Thank you for saying that?" I should have said it weeks ago. I should have said it the night it happened. Should have stood up to Rebecca and told her that making my mother sleep in the garage was unacceptable. I was a coward, and I'm sorry. The words I had been waiting to hear, the acknowledgement I had needed, finally spoken with the sincerity I had hoped for. "What changed your mind?" I asked. Michael was quiet for a moment, staring at his hands the way he had as a child when he was trying to find the right words for something difficult. "I kept thinking about how you must have felt that night," he said finally. "Lying on that daybed, listening to us entertaining our guests while you tried to fall asleep next to our garbage cans. I kept imagining what it would be like to be 73, years old, and have your own son allow someone to treat you like that." "It wasn't pleasant," I said simply. "And then I thought about the woman who planned what you did. The intelligence it took, the resources you were willing to spend, the careful way you orchestrated everything. I realized that I'd been underestimating you for years, thinking of you as someone who needed to be protected rather than someone who was capable of protecting herself." "I am capable of protecting myself," I said. "But I shouldn't have to protect myself from my own family." "No, you shouldn't, and you won't have to anymore." The promise was simple, but I could hear the weight of commitment behind it. "What about Rebecca?" I asked. "How does she feel about all this?" Michael's expression grew more complicated, and I saw him struggle with how much to reveal. "Rebecca is still angry," he said carefully. "She feels humiliated and deceived, and she's not ready to forgive what you did." "I see. And how do you plan to handle that?" "I've told her that my relationship with you is not negotiable," he said, and I heard something new in his voice, a firmness that reminded me of the boy he'd been before Rebecca had changed him. "I've told her that she doesn't have to like you, and she doesn't have to socialize with you, but she does have to treat you with basic respect if she wants to remain married to me." I felt a surge of pride for my son, mixed with concern for the strain this must be putting on his marriage. "How did she respond to that?" "Not well, initially. But we've been going to counseling, and our therapist has helped her understand some things she hadn't considered before." "Such as?" "Such as the fact that how we treat our parents sets the example for how our children will treat us. Such as the idea that kindness and respect aren't optional, even when they're inconvenient. Such as the possibility that what happened to you was a learning experience for all of us." I was surprised to hear that Rebecca had agreed to counseling, and even more surprised to hear that she might be open to examining her own behavior. Is she willing to admit that what she did was wrong? Michael hesitated, and I could see him weighing his words carefully. "She's willing to admit that the situation could have been handled better," he said. "She's willing to acknowledge that your comfort should have been a higher priority, but she's not ready to apologize. At least not yet." It wasn't everything I had hoped for, but it was more than I had expected. "And what about you? Are you willing to rebuild our relationship, even if it means standing up to your wife when necessary?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "I am. Because what you showed me that night at the mansion wasn't just that you were capable of elaborate, Revenge. You showed me that you were someone worth fighting for, someone who deserved better treatment than she was getting. And you showed me that I had failed to be the son you raised me to be. The conversation continued for another hour, covering ground that had been left fallow for too long. We talked about expectations and boundaries, about respect and forgiveness, about the difference between keeping peace and enabling bad behavior. We talked about the cost of my lesson, both financial and emotional, and whether it had been worth the price I had paid. I keep coming back to one question, Michael said as our conversation wound down. Was there any other way you could have gotten through to us? Any other way to make us understand what we were doing wrong? I had asked myself the same question many times during the silent weeks, wondering if I could have achieved the same result through less dramatic means. Maybe, I said honestly, but I don't think so. You had already dismissed my feelings once, made excuses for Rebecca's behavior, convinced yourself that what happened was just an unfortunate misunderstanding. I needed to show you both what it actually felt like to be on the receiving end of that kind of treatment. And the elaborate deception? The rented mansion? The hired staff? The performance of being wealthy? That was necessary to get Rebecca's attention, I said. She never would have listened to a complaint from someone she saw as powerless. But she couldn't ignore someone she thought had resources and influence. Michael nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. You had to become someone she respected before you could teach her a lesson about respecting others. Exactly. The irony is that I'm the same person I was before, with the same value and dignity I've always had. But she couldn't see that until she thought I had money. That says something pretty awful about Rebecca. It says something about a lot of people, I corrected gently. We live in a world where people's worth is often measured by their bank accounts rather than their character. I just used that unfortunate reality to make a point. As Michael prepared to leave, he turned to me with an expression that reminded me of the child he had been, the boy who used to seek my approval and guidance for every important decision. Mom, I know I can't undo what happened, and I know Rebecca and I have a lot of work to do to rebuild your trust. But I want you to know that I'm proud of you. Proud of me? For standing up for yourself, for refusing to be treated badly just to keep peace, for showing me that my mother is a force to be reckoned with, not just someone to be taken for granted. After he left, I sat in my quiet apartment and felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not for a return to the way things had been, because that relationship had been built on my willingness to accept less than I deserved. But hope for something new, something better, something based on mutual respect rather than convenient accommodation. The phone rang that evening, and I was surprised to see Rebecca's name on the caller ID. For a moment, I considered not answering, uncertain whether I was ready for whatever conversation she wanted to have. But curiosity won out, and I picked up the phone. Joyce? Her voice was different than I remembered, less polished, more uncertain. Hello, Rebecca. I was wondering if we could talk. In person, I mean. There are some things I need to say. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop halfway between our neighborhoods, neutral territory that belonged to neither of us. I arrived first and chose a table in the back, away from the bustle of the main seating area. When Rebecca walked in, I was struck by how different she looked. Gone was the perfectly put-together woman who had made me sleep in her garage. In her place was someone who looked tired, uncertain, more human somehow. She sat down across from me, fidgeting with her purse, strapped in a way that suggested nervousness. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," she said. "I wasn't sure you would. I'm curious to hear what you have to say." Rebecca was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. When she spoke, her voice was quieter than I remembered, less confident. "I owe you an apology," she said. "Not just for the Thanksgiving situation, but for the way I've treated you since Michael and I got married." I've been dismissive and condescending, and I've made you feel unwelcome in your own son's life." I waited for her to continue, not ready, to make this easy for her. "The truth is," she said, her voice getting smaller, "I was threatened by you." "Threatened by me? How?" "By your relationship with Michael. By the way he talks about you, the respect he has for you, the way his face lights up when he tells stories about his childhood. I was jealous of the bond you two shared, and I tried to diminish it by diminishing you." It was more honesty than I had expected from her, and it explained a lot about her behavior over the years. And the garage incident? Rebecca's face flushed with embarrassment. "That was cruel, and it was intentional. I knew we had space for you, but I wanted to put you in your place, to show you that I was the important one in Michael's life now." "And how do you feel about that now?" "Ashamed," she said simply, "and terrified that I've destroyed any chance of having a decent relationship with you." "What changed your mind? What made you realize you wanted a decent relationship with me?" Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, stirring her coffee with unnecessary intensity. "Seeing what you were capable of," she said finally. "The planning, the execution, the way you turned the tables on me so completely. I realized that I had been treating someone formidable like she was insignificant, and that was a dangerous mistake." "So you're apologizing because you're afraid of what I might do next?" "Partly," she admitted, "but also because our therapist helped me understand that the way I treat you reflects the kind of person I am. And I didn't like what I saw when I looked at myself honestly." We talked for another hour, covering ground that was both painful and necessary. Rebecca explained the insecurities that had driven her behavior, the way she had seen me as competition, rather than family, the gradual erosion of empathy that had allowed her to justify treating me badly. I listened without offering easy forgiveness, but also without the anger that had sustained me through the weeks of planning my revenge. "I can't promise that things will go back to the way they were," I told her as our conversation wound down. "Too much has happened for that, but I'm willing to try to build something new, something based on honesty rather than politeness." "What would that look like?" "It would look like you treating me with the same respect you'd show any other adult. It would look like acknowledging that I'm Michael's mother and that relationship matters. It would look like understanding that kindness isn't optional, even when it's inconvenient." Rebecca nodded, her eyes bright with what might have been tears. "I can do that," she said. "I want to do that." "And I want to believe you," I replied. "But trust is something that has to be rebuilt slowly, through actions rather than words." As winter turned to spring, we did begin to rebuild. Slowly, carefully, with setbacks and small victories and the gradual recognition that we were all capable of growth. Michael kept his promise to stand up for me when necessary, but those occasions became rarer as Rebecca made genuine efforts to change her behavior. The three of us had dinner together once a month, awkward at first, but gradually more comfortable as we learned to navigate our new dynamic. Rebecca never became warm exactly, but she became civil, then considerate, then something approaching friendly. She remembered my birthday, asked about my health, and even solicited my opinion on decorating choices for their house. More importantly, she never again suggested that my comfort was optional or my presence inconvenient. The lesson I had taught, at such great expense, had taken root, changing not just her behavior but her understanding of what respectful treatment looked like. The cost of my elaborate revenge had been significant, but as the months passed, I began to see it as an investment rather than an expense. An investment in my own self-respect, in my relationship with my son, and in the kind of family dynamic I was willing to accept. 6 months after our confrontation at the mansion, Michael called with news that both surprised and delighted me. "Rebecca wants to host Thanksgiving this year," he said, "and she specifically asked me to make sure you know that we have a beautiful guest room that she's excited for you to use. I laughed, remembering the elaborate charade that had brought us to this point. Tell her I'd be honored to accept her hospitality, I said. And Michael? Tell her I'll bring my sweet potato casserole. She was hoping you would, he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. She's been asking for the recipe. That. Thanksgiving was different from any we had shared before. The conversation was more careful, the laughter more deliberate. But underneath it all was something that hadn't been there before. Genuine respect. Rebecca treated me like an honored guest rather than an inconvenience to be managed. Michael stood a little straighter, spoke up a little more, claimed his place as both husband and son without apology, and I slept in their beautiful guest room, in Egyptian cotton sheets that rivaled those in my rented mansion, surrounded by the quiet dignity of being treated like family. As I lay in that comfortable bed, I thought about the woman who had spent a night on a daybed in their garage, listening to their laughter through the walls. She had been humiliated and angry and desperate for justice. She had also been the catalyst for everything that came after, the woman whose refusal to accept unacceptable treatment had changed all of our lives for the better. The lesson I had taught had been expensive, elaborate, and potentially destructive. It had also been necessary, transformative, and ultimately healing. Sometimes the most important lessons are the ones that cost us the most to teach, and the ones that take the longest to learn. Sometimes the best revenge is simply showing people who they really are, and giving them the chance to decide if that's who they want to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.